Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy, and today, as our usual co-hosts are away, Jo Moir is up in China with the Prime Minister and Sam Sachdeva is in Europe, of course. It's my pleasure today to welcome in Newsroom's senior political writer Marc Daalder, who's flying solo down at Parliament. Hi, Marc.
Hi.
And joining me here in the Auckland Newsroom, the producer of the marvellous daily podcast The Detail for RNZ and Newsroom, Sarah Robson. Welcome,
Hello.
Sarah.
Hello.
I think you'll find the raw nature of our podcast isn't quite in the production values of your daily marvel. A lot to talk about on today's menu. There's been a fair bit going this week, and that doesn't really include much about China, which we're really going to leave until Jo is back and can brief us on the whole thing if it's still pertinent then. But another week, another headache or two for Chris Hipkins from ministers. We'll have a look at Labor's big late move to up the funding of tertiary institutions. Is it too little, too late? And then we'll analyse if we'll all feel a bit safer with the latest law and order policies that National has run out at its annual conference. First up, Chris Hipkins can't catch a break right now, can he? Late this week, we learned via staff reporter Andrea Vance of another issue for a minister who's already been in the gun, Kiri Allan, and facing some kind of complaint in her office from a public servant. Historical, but with live aspects, being that Kiri's had to have leave for emotional and mental stress purposes just this week. And then on Thursday, Education Minister Jan Tinetti is back again. Having been through the Privileges Committee, she's made to apologise in a pretty perfunctory way to Parliament. Marc, can you give us a quick explanation and update on what both of these two mini sagas are about and what implications they have for Labor right now?
Yeah, I'll start with Jan Tinetti. She was pulled before the Privileges Committee earlier this month for making false statements to Parliament and then not correcting them when she was later made aware that they were false. The statements in question were around the school attendance figures, which Erica Stanford from National Ed asked about, and it turned out that her office had played a role in delaying the release of those figures. So the Privileges Committee has put out a report. It's a committee with all the parties from Parliament on it, and they've said, Tinetti displayed a high level of negligence, which isn't what you want your colleagues to be saying about you, but that it didn't rise to the level of contempt because it would have had to be a deliberate decision to mislead Parliament for that. For Kiri Allan, it's a little bit harder to say exactly what's going on. The Andrea Vance story that you mentioned is kind of the most we have to go off of. Kiri Allan has been back at Parliament on today, Thursday, going before select committees, taking questions from opposition MPs about any potential staffing issues in her office. She's said she's not really aware of any major issues, that she can get a bit passionate at times, but she's never yelled at any staff, and that no formal complaints have been made. And the chief executive of the Ministry of Justice said today, he's had robust discussions, is the term he used, with Kiri Allan, but that it wasn't any different from previous ministers and that it's something he thinks is part of the job.
Shouldn't we be very worried if there are robust discussions, given that word's come to mean a lot of things to a lot of people? Wasn't Nanaia Mahuta just saying the other day that her discussions with the Chinese when they were haranguing her for an hour and what were very assertive terms was robust? So robust from Kiri Allan and her office might not be a good thing, Marc.
No, I think it's a particularly diplomatic term this week. It can mean whatever you might want it to mean, but it was unfortunate timing for the Ministry of Justice chief executive to use that term when just 2 days ago, like you said, Nanaia described her conversation with the Chinese foreign minister as robust when the Australian reported it as him yelling at her for an hour. Her take seems to have been mostly that she gave back as good as she got, that she didn't put it in those terms, and I guess that's maybe what makes a robust discussion on the ninth floor or in the Beehive as well.
Bringing in Sarah now. Sarah, is this, and these two, in themselves, they seem like they're sort of self-contained, they're a bit abstract, we're not quite sure what it really means. Are they individual cases that matter, or they just generally add to a whiff of dysfunction?
I think there's certainly a whiff of dysfunction that we're getting from multiple things that have happened over recent weeks in terms of cabinet ministers and their missteps. It adds to Stuart Nash, Michael Wood. I think, everyone, this is something that's been talked about again and again and again. It feels like third-termitis coming at the end of a second term. I think Chris Hipkins must be dreading going overseas again in July and being out of the country because, as we've seen, most of these things tend to happen while he's out of the country. So, it seems like Jacinda Ardern was able to keep a lid on a lot of this in her time as the Labour leader, but again, whether the wheels are falling off, whether there's not that discipline, whether there's not that experience in terms of not just ministers who have been in government before, is it staff in the beehive as well who may not have that experience or that nous to read these situations and how they might play out politically and in the media.
I shouldn't speak for Jo Moir, given that she's not here, but Jo wrote from Beijing about the Kiri Allan thing, that actually Chris Hipkins is getting some blowback from things that Jacinda might or should have dealt with. That you say she had a lid on things, but maybe the lid was keeping some things in there that needed to come out.
Maybe some things on there for a while. And I mean, you look at when John Key was Prime Minister as well, it was the National Cabinet and caucus was run as a really tight ship, and you haven't seen that same sort of discipline after he left as Prime Minister. So whether Labour needs to get in there, get some discipline back in running. Of course, it's a massive caucus in there, which is always difficult to control. But yeah, Chris Hipkins shouldn't go overseas.
No, and I was a little worried, Marc, by a headline which was quoting him in Stuff the other day about this, saying that every minister has their moment, which struck me to be a pretty loose thing to say, given he's got 15 unaffected ministers at this point, and he's only got 4 months to go. So we could face a fair few more moments between now and the election.
Well, I mean, we got to Wednesday afternoon, and I was thinking, I kind of expected that we'd have a Labour issue pop up by now, and then Andrea Vance's article did drop. So it's becoming a weekly thing, and that's a serious problem for him. He does need to patch it up because, basically, like we discussed the other week, they haven't had any positive or proactive narrative to be putting out there. So the only thing people are hearing about Labour is around ministerial issues.
Well, hopefully we can move on to some other topic for next week's podcast. Now, moving on to the government's 11th hour attempt to shore up the universities for the funding holes that they've developed from falling enrolments and high costs. Sarah, you're a former student magazine editor at Salient. You've followed tertiary education policy for a long time. How did it get to this? It's presumably not this government's fault, all of it, because it would have been for years and years and administrations and so on, and other universities at fault as well.
This is decades of underinvestment in the tertiary sector, and this morning I did actually go and get out my 2009 salience just to brush up on my history of tertiary education funding in New Zealand, because I am that nerdy. But this is decades in the making in terms of the funding situation we've landed in now. I hate to use the cliche, but it's a perfect storm of factors. There is the impact of COVID. Of course, that meant there were no international students coming into the country. Therefore, that funding and revenue stream for universities was cut off. Per student funding from the government, so universities will receive a portion of their funding based on the number of bums they've got on seats. Now, the universities say this amount that they've been getting simply hasn't been keeping up with inflation over the last 15 years. Add to that, universities can only increase their student fees by so much each year. This is by law. This is by law. This is dictated by the annual maximum fee movement. And I had a check, and the annual maximum fee movement for 2023 was 2.75%. So you can see how this confluence of factors has sort of led to this crunch point, particularly with Victoria University and also we've seen Otago University, but all universities across the country are grappling with these sorts of financial issues. Now, when it comes to that international student income, that's kind of the only thing that universities have any discretion over. They can choose how much they want to charge international students, and that's being what's propping them up. Research funding, there's a bit of that. Philanthropy doesn't really figure in the picture for New Zealand universities. So it is a perfect storm, and the crunch has come on, and universities are trying to balance their budgets. And I think one of the really interesting things when it comes to Victoria University in particular with this is that the university, the Tertiary Education Union and Students Association have all been united in basically going to the government saying, this is your problem that you need to fix. We haven't really seen that in the past.
And Marc, I think you take the view that Labor can't get away scot-free out of this, that it really, yes, other administrations have set this in train and the universities and circumstances, but politically Labor might not have moved fast enough. The budget put more money into universities, but only starting next year. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it seems like it's something that they should have been able to predict. And when the issue did arise, it took them a while to come up with a solution, which is relatively simple. They're taking the money that the government has saved on not paying for the fees-free portion of people who aren't going to university and instead just giving it to the universities directly, or they're taking half of that money. There's a question here about exactly how they reacted as well outside of the money part of it. So there was some consternation when Vic Uni and Otago went to the Tertiary Education Commission, I think it is, to say, hey, can we work together to make sure that the cuts we do still leave across the two universities the right capabilities for, important studies around, geoscience and other things that are strategically important to New Zealand. And they were told, no, you can't cooperate in that way. You have to operate in your own silos. So even stuff like that, it just seems like it's a bit of an own goal there, where the government could have stepped in and said, look, we'll try and find some money for you. And while we're doing that, we're going to make sure that we are preserving the most important capabilities at our universities, and that there is somewhere that students can go to study every important subject. There's also a question, I think, about the quantum of the funding. That there had been, I think, an impression that the money that the government was going to put out would be enough to stave off any job cuts if the universities chose to use it in that way. But Jan Tinetti won't say anymore that actually is the case. So I wonder whether maybe at Cabinet on Monday, when they were figuring out exactly the final details of the plan, whether they may have curtailed exactly how much money they were going to give to the universities, taking it from maybe the full amount of money saved from fees-free and just halved it instead. I think maybe we'll find out when the cabinet documents are released. Maybe we never will. It's always hard to tell with these sorts of things. But I think there's a question to be asked there about whether the government actually is doing everything it can, even now after they've made this big move.
And so the other leg to the other day's announcement was, yes, the 200 and something million, or how much was it, Marc?
128.
128,
Sounds
sorry.
right, yeah.
I've inflated it. So there were two legs to this thing the other day. There was the funding of 128 million, but there was also the review of the way that tertiary education and universities are funded generally. Presumably that's something that National can work with.
I think there's a sense that tertiary education is important to New Zealand. When we're in a scenario where we have lots of skilled workforce shortages, you get skilled workers by educating them. You can import them as immigrants, sure, but if we want a sustainable long-term solution to these problems, you have a good education system. So I think there is some cross-partisan agreement on that. The solution probably won't have much agreement to it, and we'll see what comes of this review. But it is kind of clearly recognized by just about everyone in the space that it's needed, and that the current model, isn't working. Some of the impacts we're seeing, like Sarah said, aren't just because of the funding model, but are because of one-time shocks. But they highlight the weaknesses in it.
And the other thing is, of course, that both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have strong backgrounds in student politics and tertiary, and he was the Minister of Education for a long time, Hipkins. How can they be getting this wrong?
I think this is one of the really confusing parts, and this is probably where there's that weight of expectation from the sector that a Labour government would come to their rescue. Chris Hipkins was the president of Victoria University Students Association. Grant Robertson was involved in the Otago University Students Association. They have backgrounds in this stuff. They are steeped in fighting governments for better funding for universities and for students. So I guess that's one of the things that really grates. And I would also point out that unlike the GFC and the recession then, when there was that increase in student enrolments in universities, and actually universities at that time were capping numbers because they weren't getting any extra funding to deal with extra students, the opposites happened this time around. So there are fewer people enrolling, even though there's an economic downturn, because the job market has remained strong. So there's that mismatch in funding. They're not getting as much funding as they had actually forecast they would.
So, negatively, if unemployment starts to track up, do we see that as a sort of a part solution over time?
That would be the usual run of things in a recession.
Moving right along to the National Party's conference. The signature issue there again seems to be law and order. Christopher Luxon rolling out changes to sentencing, or at least the flexibility that judges have with sentencing, some more money for victims, and a peculiar or a curious policy of taking some millions away from culture reports that are written about defendants. Marc, you were there, you've written about this. How did it go down, and should we all start to feel a bit safer if National's policies come through?
Well, I think that the criminologists who you'd talk to would say there's not always a connection between safety on the streets and a sort of tough on crime approach. I do think that this policy is more light touch than the stuff that National had been running with previously, particularly around the suggestion that youth offenders would go to sort of boot camps run by the military, which was pretty widely mocked, certainly in Wellington, but I think elsewhere as well. It just seemed like a bit of an overreaction, a bit of a nasty way to deal with a serious and sad problem, and also something that was actually tried under the last National government and then scrapped because it was found not to be working. So to resurrect it without any sort of specific idea of how you'd do it differently, it just seemed a bit sloppy. This time, the policy is a bit more nuanced, a bit more thought out. There's a bit in there for everyone. You've got more money for victims, but also extending rehabilitative services to prisoners who are on remand, which is a significant number of them, actually. People who are still awaiting trial, they haven't been convicted, and as it currently stands, they're not able to access the same range of rehab services as someone who has been convicted. It turns out that 23% of offenders actually are on remand for their entire time in incarceration. By the time they get convicted, they're let out on time served. So you're letting out, about a quarter of your offenders without them ever going through those rehabilitative programs. It seemed sensible to patch that up. Turns out the government a couple weeks ago introduced a bill to do exactly that, which National wasn't exactly aware of on Sunday. But good to see bipartisan agreement on law and order is maybe the positive way to frame it. Like you said, the big bit is that sentencing one, though. So judges won't be able to discount someone's sentence by more than 40%, except in particular exceptional cases. And that's based off of a lot of anecdotes we're hearing around people whose sentences are discounted by 60 or 80 or 90% for things like youth and remorse. Whether those anecdotes are sort of actually a broader pattern is unclear, and the Ministry of Justice says it doesn't have the data, which means National says we don't know exactly what the impact of the policy will be, and also haven't costed it for that reason.
Well, I can give you an anecdotal assessment. Having gone back and looked at some sentencings from the judicial decisions online, I couldn't find any that hit over the 40% mark, and that was cursory. It was only for a few months, but there wouldn't be that many over the 40%, which means the impact is not going to be that extensive. Sure, there must be some aberrant ones for this to have come up anecdotally for National to act on it. So I wonder how much impact that'll have. Sarah, the overall play now on law and order, Act's already carved out that territory. What's the political game?
Well, I was looking back at the Ipsos, what do they call it? Their issues monitor. And out of pretty much nowhere, law and order and crime has jumped up to be the second most important issue on people's minds. Now, this is the highest it's been. It's about 40% of people, that sort of figure. And it's the highest it's been since they started monitoring this back in early 2018. It feels like one of those classic election year plays. National's looking at the 3 strikes law again, which is obviously very much Act territory. Have we moved on from that sort of hardline punishment sort of approach to law and order? I mean, remember Bill English said prisons are a moral and fiscal failure. It seems it's a hot button issue at the moment. National's just trying to cash in on it.
But is there cash there? I mean, in a political sense, given that ACT, is taking a lot of this, you're getting it back from ACT, or you're really going to get it from the centre and from the red quarter? Marc, is there real gain there? I mean, there's a strict political play. I mean, I'm not talking about the moral right or the safety of people in certain places, but for the vote winning, is it a equation that makes sense?
I think it probably is. I mean, law and order always works. It's good red meat, and it does actually reach out to a certain kind of sort of swing voter, centrist voter who is maybe slightly more socially conservative, who might have voted for Labour in 2020 with the COVID response and sort of a lack of enthusiasm around Judith Collins, but could easily find their way back to National now. All the polling seems to suggest people really are concerned about their safety. I think National is doing its best to kind of whip up a sense of lack of safety, the way Christopher Luxon talks about the mood in the nation, it running down the economy, but also on the law and order side. There's a slight irony here in that one theory for why there's more awareness of crime now, even if the numbers aren't up as high as people's fears are, as a result of the government's public interest journalism money. So one of the projects they funded was for more court reporters, particularly I think at the Herald, which means more court reporting, which means the newspaper just runs a lot more articles about crime. Maybe it's the same level, maybe it's slightly higher, but the coverage it's getting is significantly higher, and so people have a perception that there's a lot more crime going around. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the public interest journalism, but just sort of a little ironic twist, I think, in there as to part of what might be driving this sense of fear over law and order. I really do think that is out there, though, that people are concerned about that, and therefore addressing it one way or another is probably a good way to wrestle over some votes.
One of the sadder things, just to finish off on law and order here, is that National points out that under Labour, the numbers in prison in the last 3 years have fallen and fallen and fallen. So there's about 8,300 in prison now at the end of March. That had been up at 9+ in 2020, and under National it was 9+. But isn't it sad that the fact that we're having fewer people go to prison actually could be viewed as a negative, and we need to get more people back in there to up the numbers and therefore supposedly secure the streets. Does it work?
I'm no law and order expert, but I don't know. I keep coming back to Bill English. Prisons are a moral and fiscal failure.
Our question today asks, what's with these Air Force jets? And why do we even need passenger planes in New Zealand just to cart politicians around? Why can't they book on Air New Zealand? Sarah, you've been on them.
I have been on them. I'm probably the only member of the press gallery who's been on an overseas trip where the plane hasn't broken down.
Got you back safely, so...
Got me back safely, and also got me over my fear of flying, ironically. It's back now that I don't do these 757 trips. But I would say there's been a lot of talk about these planes being VIP transport planes, but they are used for a lot more than just carting the Prime Minister, a media delegation and a trade delegation back and forth from Asia. They are used by the Air Force for aid, deployments, cargo, all sorts of things. They can strip all the seats out and they can bung in a whole bunch of aid and get it to where it needs to go. These planes need to go on the scrap heap. They are not flash. I have sat in the business class seats once, and they were, they were okay, but nothing fancy. They didn't fully recline. But they need to be upgraded, but no government wants to upgrade them because it's framed as, money being spent to, zhuzh up your VIP plane. But what New Zealand's got pales in comparison to what others have. And as I say, they're used for far more than just ferrying politicians and royals around the place.
And having your own plane does have its benefits. Just on Thursday, as our Prime Minister went from Beijing to Shanghai, the Chinese ambassador in Wellington, Mr. Wang, he hitched a ride. So you spend time with your diplomatic buddies, other politicians. Jacinda Ardern hitched a ride on the Canadian flight from Trudeau. When was that? Was that after the Queen's Jubilee? Yes, one of those big summits in the UK. So you do get some benefits, even in the diplomatic sense, from it. And I just think Chris Luxon saying, we can go commercial, the costs aren't that good. The availability isn't that good, and you can't just take 90 people with you like we do on these missions and get them places.
You're not going to get media going on these missions and these trips because it increases the cost so much. So are we happy with our Prime Ministers going off overseas without media coverage of what they're doing? I don't think the Prime Minister would want that either. They'd want some media coverage of their forays into diplomacy and world politics at APEC and wherever else.
I reckon we'll have a new Airbus within 3 years.
I think Chris Luxon will take his first trip overseas on Air New Zealand. I assume he gets business class or first class for life. And he'll be so upset that no one in New Zealand has written about it that we'll be back on the 757s the next time round.
Right, we can wrap up now with some recommendations, something that the panel has seen, heard, read over this week that you might find interesting over your weekend. So Marc, what's grabbed your attention?
There's an excellent article in the New York Times kind of taking the idea of the three-body problem from physics, where when you introduce three elements, things get wacky and hard to calculate and hard to predict, and applying that to the nuclear arms relationship between the United States, Russia, and now China coming in as a third player that, again, makes things hard to predict. It's thoughtful and entertaining and just an interesting way of approaching foreign policy.
Is it basically, Marc, that two's company and three's a crowd?
I think I wouldn't say necessarily that two's company either when we're talking about nuclear weapons, but that's roughly the idea.
Sarah?
Well, my attention was grabbed by this fascinating exclusive from The Guardian about Rishi Sunak using erasable ink pens on official documents and in official meetings. It feels a bit Harry Potter, to be honest, which is totally fine. But it got me thinking about the importance of notes in the margins of official documents. So this Guardian story talks about Margaret Thatcher and the notes in the margins in the Falklands War, over the miners' strike. And even here in New Zealand, this has been relevant. Back in 2015, there was a story about a predictive risk modelling tool that MSD was proposing to use. And in the OIA documents that came out of that, there was the written note from the Social Development Minister at the time, Anne Tolley, saying, "Not on my watch. These children are not lab rats." And that put an end to this predictive risk modelling tool that was basically going to leave at-risk kids, monitor them whether they were abused or not. So it's looking at the importance of, what do you erase or what can you erase, and permanence, and why notes are important.
Two things about that. Who has pens that erase themselves? Is that some kind of MI6 thing?
Actually, I think in the story it explains that from a Japanese supplier, and they are supplied by the civil service for use of various departments. They cost just under £5, these pens. I'd quite like to give them a go and actually see how good the erasing process is. But yeah, food for thought there.
I actually read the story as well earlier this week and had a go at asking a couple of ministers if they'd used erasable pens, and they all said they hadn't. But I guess we wouldn't know. They'd have erased the evidence.
And you're right, Sarah, these notes do make history. My favourite anecdote I can remember is from Singapore's founding Prime Minister, a speech prepared for him. He's very exacting, very bright, very demanding of these things. And in the margins of this speech, he had simply written, "persuasive but not convincing," full stop, which I took to be a very sort of get rid of that and go back and start your work again, thank you. Look, my recommendation for the week is an internal one. It's for the detail. Not just because Sarah's here, but an excellent detail podcast this week by Alexia Russell. This one was called A Tale of Two Gang Towns. Well worth a listen. Two entirely contrasting approaches between Opotiki in the North Island and Timaru in the South. Different views, different viewpoints, and a different level of tolerance, perhaps, and short and long-term views of these things. Well worth a listen.
Great podcast. Listen and subscribe.
And that's it from Raw Politics for the week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, our readers, listeners, and watchers. Please send any burning questions to Jo Moir, jo.moir@newsroom.co.nz. She can receive those on her return, and we'll seek to answer the best of them. Thanks to Sarah for joining us.
Thank you.
What do you think of the Raw Politics setup?
Look, the camera's a bit disconcerting. I'm going to make some improvements to the setup here in Auckland. I'm not going to tell anyone back at RNZ.
Thank you. Keep our private things private, won't you?
We'll keep this here.
And thanks, Marc, of course, at Parliament.
Thanks, Tim. It's always a good time.
And you can find us next week, same time, same place, maybe with better quality sound, if Sarah can pull strings for us. And here on Spotify or at YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.